And one of our goals always is to have informed voters. All of these questions are coming up. We think that it's the past. It's never the past. The past is always present. And so if you know the history of things that have been tried, then you can join the conversation, right? It gives you confidence to be part of civic conversations.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Tree Hugger Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Yadrick, and I'm coming to you from Puyallup Territory, aka Grit City, Tacoma, Washington, on the southern edge of the Salish Sea. This show is grounded in ecological restoration, the science, practice, and humans tangled up with ecosystems. It's work that holds the promise of healthier communities, thriving more than human worlds, and a just transition in a rapidly changing climate. We ask not just what we can restore, but how, for whom, and with whom. A year ago, I also founded Madrone Grove Adaptation and Restoration, a small, intentionally scrappy consulting practice rooted in place, in collaboration, and in the crooked tenacity of Pacific madrone trees. Madrone groves remind us that life doesn't always grow straight, but it grows deep, adaptive, and persistent. That's the spirit I bring to this work in forests and in communities. If you have a small project you wish to collaborate on, let me know, reach out. You can find me on social media and contact information in the show notes. If you want more of my writing, reflections, and stories from the edge of restoration, you can find me on Grove and Grit, my Substack, where I explore everything from fieldwork to ethics to learning what land and love teach us when we slow down and listen. Today's episode takes us to the living forest, the living story of forests. I had the great privilege of talking with Jennifer Ott, Executive Director of HistoryLink, the free, continually evolving online encyclopedia of Washington state history that serves teachers, scholars, students, journalists, and history lovers of all kinds. Jennifer is an environmental historian who looks at how people moved dirt, rerouted waterways, and leveled entire hills, and called it progress. She's the author of Olmsted in Seattle, co-author of Waterway, the story of Seattle's locks and ship canal, and editor of Seattle at 150, Stories of the City Through 150 Objects. HistoryLink isn't just a website of facts and dates. It was the first regional history encyclopedia built expressly for the internet, founded in the late 1990s by local historians, with the idea that history belongs to the community and that understanding the past can enrich our decisions today. Today, HistoryLink features thousands of original essays and timeline entries, big histories and small, all grounded in archival research, community memory, and deep curiosity. In many ways, it's a space where place matters, where the everyday and the extraordinary are woven together, and where meaningful context is more important than the neat narratives. In our conversation, Jennifer and I dive into the Forest History Project, a collaborative effort supported by the Washington Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. This project expands HistoryLink's work into the long, rich, and often contested histories of forests in our region. It includes curriculum modules on forest fires, women in forestry, and indigenous relationships to land, scores of feature essays on everything from tree farming and industrial logging to fire lookouts and tribal forestry traditions, and a dozen or so oral histories with forest stewards, which include tribal leaders, agency leads, lumber workers, conservationists, and activists whose voices reflect the real complexity of forest history. We talk about why forest history matters now, not as the static past, but as a living framework that shapes how we think about land, power, stewardship, and ecological futures. That theme, the politics of knowledge, reminds me of something Max Laborion writes in Pollution is Colonialism, which I just finished after a long read/listen. Knowledge is not neutral. It is created and circulated within networks shaped by power, and those power relations influence what we value, what we count, and what we remember. That idea resonates deeply with how Jennifer and HistoryLink approach storytelling. Not as a single authority, but as a web of voices and archives that are always unfolding. So in this conversation, we explore not just what happened in our forests, but who gets to tell these stories, whose voices have been obscured, and how history can inform better decisions for the forests and people we are still shaping today. Jennifer also shares reflections on how environmental writing, from early conservation voices to contemporary indigenous scholars, has shaped public understanding and policy, and how a project like this can illuminate paths forward rooted in justice, ecology, and lived experience. So whether you're a restoration practitioner, a history lover, an educator, or someone who ever stood in the shade of a Douglas fir and wondered how it came to be there, this conversation will expand the way you think about forests, time, and the stories we live with. Let's get into it.
My name is Jennifer Ott. My day job is I'm the executive director at HistoryLink. I also have a degree in environmental history. And I was lucky to go to the University of Washington when Richard White was still there. He took me through a seminar that was just amazing about environmental history and how do we read primary texts and all of this. And so then I decided to go to graduate school, and I ended up at University of Montana with Dan Flores, and also amazing. Then I realized I didn't actually want to be an academic. I didn't want to move like you have to be willing to move. And I just got lucky. I ended up at the Amana Society in Iowa, Amana Heritage Society. And because we were living out there for a little while. And it was a museum around a communal society that privatized in the 1930s. But the corporation that was formed to handle the assets remained intact. It was an amazing environmental history story because it was a 26,000 acre farm plus forest, so cropland and forest land. And it was just, I loved it. It was a unique space to be exposed to public history. I had an executive director that would do game for anything. So we did all these great programs. Then I decided I really, really still wanted to write. And so happily I found HistoryLink. I started as a freelance writer and then worked my way up over 18 years.
Excellent. Thanks for the introduction. So you said Richard White, and it brings me back to college or something. I read The Organic Machine,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And then subsequently a couple other things.
Yeah, and his land use, environment, and social change, his history of Island County. I wish they'd given it a different title because I give it to people a lot. Ignore the title. It was in a different time, and it was intended as an academic study, but he's just such a great writer, and it's a good storybook. So many directions to go with his work.
I was trying to remember where I originally came across HistoryLink. It's been coming in a newsletter, I guess, is the way I interact with it for like years. And this one jumped out to me because some of the headlines were about this forest history project. But honestly, you end up in my Google searches as well. I don't know. I'm making this up, but like the Tacoma Dome or the shoreline of Lake Washington or Olmsted Parks in Seattle or apples in Washington State. I don't know, like a broad breadth of things that y'all cover.
We have 8,400 articles now, and one of our challenges is how do we draw people into that? How do you provide paths of discovery? Because it's a lot to take in. So the newsletter is one way that we do this. It's This Week in History is the theme of it, and it's tied somehow to the date, which is fun. And then we announce other projects that we're doing or finishing or all that. One of the challenges is how do you help somebody find things they don't know in a fun way, just make it enjoyable. We're in the midst of some work on that, and then we'll be doing a redesign of the site in the coming probably year and a half. It's been 7 years since we redesigned the site. So
I'm interested in forests, obviously. So I'm really interested in what inspired on the Forest History Project and how it fits in the broader mission of making Washington's history accessible and relevant.
The direct impetus for the project was that we are lucky we have two board members, Douglas Howe and Michael Sullivan, who have connections to forest history. Douglas's family owned the Willer Osgood mill here in Tacoma. Michael Sullivan has worked on everything. I'm sure a lot of your listeners will know him. He's a Tacoma historian. His firm that he ran for years with his partners was Artifacts, and they did historic preservation work. And he worked with Mark Pagano at UW Tacoma on the new cross-laminated timber building. They created a historical display about forest history in Washington. Like, cross-laminated timber is such an interesting point we're at now of the future of forestry. Michael went back into the photographs. He's just an amazing researcher, and it's a beautiful exhibit that they put together. One of the things we do at HistoryLink is we started as a Seattle-King County site in 1999, and then 2003 we went statewide because almost immediately you start bumping against those borders, and there's so many stories that go beyond the county. The challenge is how do you cover topics when so much of our funding comes from King County? How do we find other avenues of funding that will get us with better statewide coverage. And we're always building that. And lots of projects have gone into this, but that's one thing we always look at is, can we make this a statewide topic? Can we find funding statewide for this? We were lucky we had some support in the state legislature, and we were able to get the first year's funding covered. And we're lucky it was this past year, not this year. Allison Brooks at the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation managed the funding. We wanted to take a look at the foundational pieces. How do you understand the big picture of Washington State's forest history? We took regional histories. We still have one more to go. We need to do a Puget Sound one. But we took regional histories because the forest types for those regions tend to be fairly cohesive. And the history story of a forest type tends to be a narrative that makes sense. And so you have ponderosa pine, or you have Douglas fir, or the hemlock, or the spruce stories. And so we took the regional stories, and that was the big framework that we developed for this project. David Williams wrote a biography of the Douglas fir for us, which at first he proposed that, and we thought, oh, that's interesting, but it's like, that's perfect. Douglas fir is essentially a character in Washington state history. Mm-hmm. And so it was good to look at it from that perspective, like, what is the life story of the Douglas fir as a species? Mm-hmm. And so this first phase, there is quite an assortment of topics because we reached out to writers that we knew had worked in this area, and the state funding was just amazing. We could be responsive to what the writers wanted to do with their research. We were able to get some great stories, and then we did the interviews. And that was a way to get this more recent history, which is always so hard to capture.
Yeah, David Williams, that name sounds familiar. I've seen some of his work, most recently about Puget Sound and the regrades in Seattle, stuff like that.
His next book's on the Cascade Mountains.
Oh, really?
And so there was a nice synchronicity with what he was working on already.
Yeah, we had a close call. We almost did an interview a couple years ago. I can't remember what happened, but we didn't connect. So sorry, David. And then I also saw your name on a curriculum that's associated with the project, which seems like a huge deal as well. Distills it really into like themes about fire, women in history, and indigenous relationships on the land. Can you share something about these stories and how it challenges or expands the narratives in Washington's forest history?
Yes, when we do curriculum, we always look at doing single lessons. We've learned that over the years, that teachers have so many demands on their time that the best strategy is to provide them single lessons that they can weave into things they're already doing. And it's a great opportunity to give them the resources to teach a topic that they might not have the time to do the research themselves for. And so if you make it super easy, then they can pick it up, use it, and then their students get that augmented content. We worked with 3 teachers, one from Spokane Valley, one from Lacey, and one from Lake Stevens area. And they looked at the content we were developing, and they also just had their own interest areas and things that they had worked on in the past. And so those gelled together into the lessons. The hard part is always keeping it limited to a lesson a teacher can do. They had more great ideas, but we kept it succinct and hopefully very easy regardless of the teacher's background in forest history. Because a lot of teachers might not have any experience with the lumber industry or with ecology or any of that. And so how do you make it so they can pick it up, put sort of a plug and play? And these teachers are just really good at this. They're really good at teaching teachers how to do things. And the idea is that we also have the annotated timeline, which was a project that we did. We often do that before we do a book project, because it's a great way to scope out the story we're going to tell, who are the key players, what gaps do we have that we need to do, really targeted research. We've found that those annotated timelines are not just good for internal use. They're excellent. Pick and choose and share with students, all the different things. And then our assistant editor, Mindy Van Wingen, did the timeline, and she's amazing. She created a spreadsheet so you can sort it by region, theme, date, all these different ways to explore the data. And we have 2 types, well, multiple types, but 2 of the primary types of content on History Link are feature articles and timeline entries. And the idea of the features or articles is it's just like an encyclopedia, alphabetical, topical. And then the timeline entry is just that. It's a timeline of history. One of the things we've learned over and over again is that if you dive into a date you might be familiar with, say Mount St. Helens, 1980, then go backward and forward in time, it's almost always surprising what was happening at the same time in a different part of the state or even nearby when those big sort of iconic events happen. And so a timeline, as I was reading through it while Mindy was working on it, I had no idea that those two things were so close in time. And it really shifts your perspective and helps you start to see relationships that you might not see if you kept them siloed by their own individual articles. And so that's a part of it. And that will eventually, the next phase is a book project. It will be really helpful for scoping that out. Oh, and then we did 2 podcast episodes. We're starting a new podcast this fall called Field Notes with History Link. The idea is it's a way to explore the content on the site in new and engaging ways. And so we've asked 6 guest curators each to do an episode where they pick 2 to 3 articles that they think are interesting. And then they talk about them in the places that are related to those topics. So our forest fire one is with Russ Holter, who's a Tacoma fellow, and they did the interview in Eatonville. And then David did one on the Douglas fir, and it's in his backyard next to a big giant Douglas fir. So those 2 episodes will be part of that series, and we were able to use this funding to get those 2 in the can.
Well, I'm definitely a podcast fanatic. I used to listen to more. I told you about my bus ride back and forth to Seattle. So it was like the prime time of podcast listening in my life. I feel really guilty. Like I have this top 5 list of podcasts and I try to stay on top of it all the time. And I just feel like I can't listen to enough. I look forward to listening to it. So I feel like it provides another level of accessibility in addition to the website and reading it, but also you can consume it via wherever you are, on the road, on a walk.
That's what we're hoping is. I take the bus also, and I prefer to listen when I'm on the bus because I don't like to just keep my head down in my phone. And so we're hoping that people will listen to an episode on their bus ride, and there'll be links to related articles in the show notes. And so if their curiosity is piqued.
Yeah, so you talked about timelines and forest history. It spans, I don't know, I would say chronologically, going back the Wayback Machine, like indigenous stewardship, like industry, activism, which actually really interests me because that's what sparked my fire for like forest interest back in the day. And then I think restoration, I don't know if you really have an interest or know about ecological restoration, but I saw little threads of that as well. So how do you navigate the tension between all these histories, especially in a state where forestry has meant different things to different people?
People feel very strongly. I think this is where my background in environmental history helps. If you're familiar with William Dewey's book, Enchantment and Exploitation, I read that as an undergrad. I feel like that has stuck with me my entire career, is he puts the Sangre de Cristo Mountains at the center of the story. The political story is not primary, and the economic story is not primary. None of the cultural groups are primary. Everyone has a relationship to the place where they live and the place where they work. And so how it decenters some of the human politics that will influence how a story is told, because it's really hard not to take a stand of like, this was right, that was wrong, or this was a mistake. Because it's challenging history. So by putting the forest at the center of the story, we all have relationships to it. We all are learning. I have no pretense that I know the answer to forest management in Washington. And there's certainly things I think we shouldn't do ever again that we've done in the past. But I don't think there's a lot of people advocating for a return to when the Van Sickle book out of Grays Harbor, they tried to cut it all.
Yeah.
Which I think is like one of the best book titles
heyday
ever. Yes.
Of,
just
timber.
mow it down, right? As fast as you could. And we've learned so much since then. But in our conversations in preparing for which stories to tell and who to talk to, we talked a lot about change over time, that it needs to be made really clear that there is no static one story. Like you can't even say any companies had a single story, or even any environmental groups. Some maybe short-lived companies or groups were singular focus. But those stories are really complex. And then in an encyclopedia, you aren't writing a book. You're not writing a thesis and a big argument about a philosophy of history. You're trying to tell people enough facets of the story that they can start to kind of look at it as a whole and move it around and realize that some things have more impact than others. And that is important. You shouldn't say they're all equal. But to look at where are people coming from, what led them to the action that they were doing, what are the influences? Like, it's so interesting how market influences that are unrelated to forest policy can then influence how things are being harvested and sold. If you don't understand that those bigger forces are going on or the external forces are going on, then how do you understand the change over time? And so we put a limit of 4,000 words on our feature article, which is nothing. But if every time we've gone over it, no matter how good the writing, it's too long. It's too much to take in a screen the way that we have it. And so we try and keep them closer to 3,000 words, so that it's something you can take in and it's a piece of the story. It's a matrix that we're building. I like that because it often feels like when I walk away from having read a few articles around a topic, I have this sense of the texture and what questions to ask. And we were talking about parks before we started, and I was involved with Olmsted Parks advocacy. I did not know that your average historian could join the conversation. I just didn't know I should speak up and say, I know some of that story. I can tell you what we've done in the past. And people seem to appreciate it. I try not to lecture people. But I think it's that old adage that knowledge is power. Once you have knowledge, you can think critically, you can be an engaged listener, and then you can also have an opinion that's well-founded. Not
Excellent.
just instinct.
No, so cool. Yeah, you talked about word limits, and I struggle with that on the podcast as well, like the length of this conversation. And your podcast as well, like weaving stories together. And we could easily edit this down into a story where I narrate, and then your voice shows up for like 30 seconds or whatever. I don't feel like it does it justice. So I've chosen this format. So it's not too short, too long. An hour is where I usually cap it. And then some podcasts are like 3 hours long or whatever. Like, who has time to listen to that? But then some of my favorite podcasts are like tidbits, like 5 or 15 minutes where you can listen to it on a drive across town or whatever. So yeah, that's
we're
interesting.
Exploring the limits. We have one called An 8-Year-Long Emergency. And it's 6 episodes about the decision to build the tunnel to replace the viaduct in Seattle.
Oh, wow.
And that one is 30 to 40 minutes per episode. Dominic Black did a really great job mixing in audio and all that. The one before that was Square One, 3 episodes, and they were closer to an hour, I believe. And that was about the LGBTQ history of Pioneer Square in Seattle. Yeah. That one worked because the producer was good at weaving together different elements. So it wasn't just one person talking. I think that would be harder to pull off with a long form. But the field notes will only be 20 to 30 minutes.
Nice.
Just little snippets, little conversations.
All right. Yeah. Looking forward to it. I also want to touch on something I think you said, but I want to dig a little deeper. I think you said something about history repeating itself. I think for lack of better cliche, I guess that is history linear?
No.
No,
yes. I wouldn't say linear. I feel like it is almost a zigzag, back and forth, and there's pieces that percolate up and gain significance again. I think of it in an urban landscape, and when you speak about any sort of planning or zoning sort of processes, is to understand why things are the way they are helps you make decisions about how you might proceed forward. Sometimes things that seem logical are not, because you have to think about what steps did we take to get where we are, so that we can understand, like, how might this unfold if we make a new change to it. And I'm not opposed to change. I'm not somebody who thinks everything has to be frozen in time. But there are things that have worked and should be protected. And the texture of community matters. There's a strength and a diversity of older buildings, newer buildings, older landscapes, newer landscapes. I remember in a discussion in Seattle was about putting housing next to, I think it's in where the armory is in Inner Bay. They're looking at putting housing there. I remember being concerned because that zoning decision was made so that industrial uses were next to each other. Just because the land would be a good deal, because it was it was going to be surplus from the National Guard, I guess that'd be state, that it would be a good deal. But that doesn't mean that we should put housing there, even though we need housing desperately. Like, no, look at the historic development of that landscape. Think about why those decisions were made and invest in better land with better access to neighborhood amenities, because that extra cost is going to pay off in the long run. And a lot of that with parks accessibility. You can't just say it's accessible because it's within a certain distance, which was Olmsted's goal, within a half mile of every house. But you have to think about, what does that half mile involve? What do you have to traverse? I always think of when I had little ones, and it's a different thing to cross a big street with little ones than it is as an adult. And so thinking about, why are things not successful because they didn't take into account those sort of long-term elements of neighborhood construction.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of my old neighborhood near the water in South Lake Union, I guess. And now it's kind of the epicenter of like tech. I've just lived through the reworking of Mercer while we lived there too. It was such a craziness, spaghetti of roads and whatnot. So it's almost like the heart of Seattle.
It is. It's a nexus point. And
Yeah.
if you look at the long-term plans developed in the 40s, and they were, I think, very smartly not fulfilled. They were going to put the Bay Freeway through there.
Right.
But there was a reason that they were going to put the Bay Freeway through there. There was a logic to it, just like there was a logic for the viaduct. And so if you have to look at the logic and think, is there a more reasonable way to do the same result?
Yeah. And then I also saw some park history. It was like a poster board in my office for a while. I saw like a design for like a big park that like kind of a park that would have, the commons that would have extended South Lake Union, which direction south, like up the hill a little
To
bit.
Westlake.
Yeah, to Westlake.
All the way downtown.
That would have been crazy.
Crazy. The other piece about the past always being present is that I've been lucky to work with a few tribes on history, and particularly I just finished a book on the Seattle waterfront. And so that's been what I've been involved with. And I worked with Warren King George from the Muckleshoot tribe. And I feel like I finally understand the idea that a place can be radically changed and it doesn't matter to the tribal members, that Seattle is still Zitzalalik. It's not that it used to be or it's the site of. It is both at the same time. And so the street signs that are up are really meaningful, where they put Zitzalalik on the street signs. I think of it as like that thousands of years of connection. It's substantially, it's meaningful history is still present. It's not just something we should document, but it's something that is still living, and we should still engage with it as, what does this place mean to different groups? Because that meaning is significant and it can shape how it develops. And a corollary to that is that water always remembers where it wants to go. We have done a lot of engineering that reroutes where water goes. And as climate change happens, as sea level rise happens, South Park in Seattle is having a really hard time with this. And then there's the tribes out on the coast that are having to move their communities because the water is just encroaching. And so, the environmental historian in me is that it's not just to document, it's to understand where I live today.
Yeah.
How do I know this place? And what's missing? What slices have been taken out? My master's thesis was on the fur desert policy, where the Hudson's Bay Company took all the beaver out of the Snake River Basin in order to keep Americans out and make money. And I always thought of, after I did that project, I always thought of understanding the environment here is like, it's always been a layer cake, right, of all these pieces that come together. But there's layers that have been pulled out. And so thousands of years of coevolution, and then you take a keystone species of beaver and their water management in arid places, then the place that we live in the post-settlement era is a different place. And how is it functioning? And what happens if you bring beaver back, which they're doing in lots of places.
I think just a little tidbit, if people want to go back into some tree hugger archives, there's a few chats about, we've talked about reintroduction of animals. I'm usually a vegetation guy. We talk about a lot of plants and whatnot, but talking about animals and reintroduction is important to restoration. I think you touched on it, like just some of these interviews or like a phrase or these memories or feelings that kind of stuck with you through the project. You're talking about the conversations with the Muckleshoot tribe. Are there any other things that kind of stick out to you with the Forest History Project?
We didn't talk with Warren about forest history. We will, because I am very curious to talk about the Muckleshoot's acquisition of forest land and what their goals are and what they're doing. And so, but we did, I was lucky, I got to do 2 of the interviews. I'm not supposed to be doing content development as the executive director, but it worked out well because I was out in Eastern Washington.
You're the boss.
Exactly. I'm in charge. But I went to Chihuahua and interviewed Lynn and Becky Miner. They have spent 25 years, 30 years converting from a dairy farm into a healthy forest, 100 acres. It's amazing. It's so beautiful out there. And then they're donating it to Washington State University for a research forest. It's just amazing. And they have a log cabin that the students will be able to use to stay in. Just amazing potential there. And then I also got to interview Cody Desatel, who is the executive director of the Colville Tribes. And his career prior to being the executive director is that he was in their forestry program. So those are the two that I have the most direct connection with because they were fascinating conversations. But the ones that I didn't connect but I've read, the thing that really sticks with me, and it's not surprising, is that if you are involved with forests in Washington, you are deeply connected to the land and you see all the change that is coming with climate change and the changing forest practices. I'm just was so drawn into the connection to place because I think that's something we struggle with in the general public right now is that we're so connected via technology that is to some degree placeless. How do we retain our connection to where we live and how it works and understanding the relationships in the non-human world? You need to know a place to understand those. I was really struck by the Northwest Forest Plan being now 30 years old-ish. And so I've been reading, I've just started another book about it, is trying to catch up because I certainly had disengaged from that conversation, right? Once it was stopping people yelling at each other in public about it, then I didn't pay as much attention. But we've learned so much about science in 30 years. And the industry's changed and environmental movements have changed, right? Like everything is different. And so I am very interested to see how that story, like if it does get reconsidered, what that process will look like given the science that we have now and given the changing economy. I really enjoyed reading William Dietrich's Final Forest, the updated edition.
Updated edition, really?
Oh, yeah, he did.
Okay.
And the last chapter looks back at what happened to these folks and these communities. And I always appreciated that book because you can have whatever feelings you have about forests and cutting them, but they're people, right? They're people stories. And I lived in a small logging community in Oregon when I was in grade school. And it was right when they were closing the federal forest there, and the trees were just getting too small for the mills anyway, right? They were going to have to decide to retool or close. And I wouldn't wish that on anyone. Going through a very small town, it was 500 people, and people were losing their jobs. You can't sell your house in a small Oregon town that's a logging industry town. No one wants your house. So what do? I was 10, 11 when we lived there. I remember the landslide we had because there was a clear cut and the rain, it was a particularly rainy winter, one of the years we were there, and there was a small landslide, and I remember being very, very affected by that.
Right, yeah.
And
literally everything is shaking up around you politically, and then in your physical landscape as well.
Yeah. What's sustainable?
Yeah. That reminds me, you do cover like company towns related to places that were created, like Port Gamble. I've heard stories, very similar to like those backwoods little towns that really everybody is employed by the same capitalist, I guess. And with all the big trees are gone and the mills retooling and those economic decisions, sometimes convert forests to suburbs too, which has happened around Puget Sound as well. It's a huge thing. Yeah, there's
conservation through working forests. And if you don't have working sawmills to have working forests, then what do you do? The Mountains of Sound Greenway. What do you do to protect that forest if it's not being carefully managed logging? Because it's too close to an urban area. It's going to start to have pressure on it. It gives me anxiety.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, having done a lot of mountain running through the Mountains of Sound Greenway. When I lived in Seattle, that was kind of the backyard. I get in the Issaquah Alps and up into the foothills of the Cascades. There's a lot of the working forests, and some of it's like Forest Stewardship Council certified, and so there's this whole like kind of beauty of keeping everything green where people can see it as they drive through Interstate I-90. But on the backside, that's where all the cutting happens. That's where people start to complain. Tiger Mountain Trail is all cut over, and I get rerouted my favorite trail or whatnot. So yeah, there is still, let's see, state lands and private lands are still being worked, and it's kind of hard. Sometimes it's invisibilized because you actually don't see it because it's unsightly. Because when I was growing up, very apparent.
Right
as
there
we
on the side of the road.
Yeah, as you like family drives or family trips, in the car, it was just, you'd see stuff mowed down. I have cousins too out in Aberdeen that grew up in, where they worked in the forest as well. So hearing their experiences in the woods too and how it's changed, yeah, it's very apparent. And so when you drive through parts of Grays Harbor County as well, it's much different than my livelihood that I have around forests here in the urban areas of Tacoma, which is like almost like similar but very different.
Sort of like the forest for the trees. The adage is, here in the city, we get attached to individual trees. And or groups of trees, and then you have those thousands and thousands of acres of trees managed by humans for thousands of years. To just say we should remove humans, I don't think is a good idea, because that's not actually how they evolved to what they are. I mean, it's always hard when the market economy, I think of this with farming too, is if the market is deciding land management policies, that's tricky because that's really complicated. And who am I to tell someone who owns acreage and that is their investment, that is where their livelihood comes from? Who am I to say you can't cut that? I buy the thing they make out of those, or at least I benefit from the supply of lumber. All or none is hardly ever quite the right answer. And that's why I think history is so helpful, is you can be like, well, there's a million versions of this in our past. There are so many ways to manage a forest. What can you learn from the things that worked well? We have over a century of commercial logging. And so we can start to see like what is the end game on some of these landscapes. How does a forest evolve after it's been clear cut? I appreciate that we have stories on the experimental forest. And I love that there's so much to learn. Like we don't know what we don't know. What can we learn? And I think that's where, when you get into the argument we've had for a very long time of logging, no logging, preserve, conserve, the different perspectives on that, wise use and all of that, is there's a bit of an assumption, not 100% wrong, that there is a right answer. And I'm not sure there is. I think, and then with climate change or bark beetles or whatever is going to come, it's so complex. We should be more open to where is the middle ground. And I don't think that's just because I'm somebody who doesn't like to argue. I think it's because I see unexpected outcomes of like the blowdown in 1962 or Mount St. Helens, right? That unbelievable destruction of timberland, but then look what came after it. And so I enjoy that I don't have to make decisions for the timber industry. I can instead learn from the past, but I do really love that it is not a straight line ever. It's interesting.
Yeah, and you mentioned the experimental forestry feature on the project, and did really teach us a lot about the curiosity and innovation and sort of long-term thinking that a lot of people put into managing forests. And you mentioned these like 100-acre place people own. There's so many different reasons for managing forests that will outlive us as well. So you think about that timeline moving forward where we'll be dead and gone. I imagine a lot of these forests are still going to be here for next generation. Thoughts about sustainability as well of the forest land, I think, is important because we want it. We want forest now. We want forests in our future, right?
I talk about sometimes that I like to look back at history, not because I think we've survived worse before, right? That's, some people think, oh, we've been through worse. The clear-cut era of the late 19th century was much harder on our environment than it is now. But I don't like to think of history that way because not everyone survived. And a lot of really important places of significance to people were lost. And a lot of lives were lost. I mean, the lumber industry in those years was terrifying. And so, but instead, I like to look back at history and say, we've been through really hard times before. What worked? What got us out of it? What in the end ended up not being as bad as we thought it was going to be? I remember when St. Helens blew and you saw the destruction. It's like, oh, it's ruined, right? That's never coming back. That's going to be bare forever. Because I was not a scientist. I was a kid. I didn't know there was even the possibility of recovery from something like that. I mean, people lost their lives in that, and people lost their livelihoods. And I don't pretend like there weren't really harsh consequences of that. But we can learn an awful lot about what can help us propel forward.
I've hiked through or ran through the blast zone, I don't know, 10 years ago now at this point in time, and it's amazing. Relatively new forest science. There was a lot to be learned, like Jerry Franklin et al. You know, they learned a lot from studying the succession of forests after that disaster. Well, there's a proper experimental forests like Wind River or the H.J. Andrews or Pack Forest, and so there are these little hubs of community of forest scientists get together and chat about things.
It's amazing what they've learned and have been able to apply outward from there. I would just add that this really is very much the phase one that we did we've completed. We were on a deadline because it was state funding, and so you had to finish it by a certain date. And so we wanted to be responsive to what our writers were working on in areas of interest. And so the next phase, we'll do more articles, more interviews, people that are a little harder to get in the same room with. We'll be able to do those interviews because we want to do more on labor. Knowing the forest through work is an amazing, interesting topic. And then also how does that interact with the other labor history in Washington State? It's pretty fascinating, the transient labor and so many interesting things to discover there. The landscape of the labor unions has changed so much that actually turned out to be a challenging topic. So we need to set aside some time, send off a couple writers to really find what are the good sources, where are the repositories of information. There aren't very many unions that are solely for lumber workers in the state. They've subsumed into locals for other unions.
Yeah, I imagine too. And like talk about transient labor, it's like people who are maybe have come here and settled here, and some people who are forced out and are left, and so a lot of that history is lost. And like you said, the industry has changed and whatever. So
there's not many like oral histories with the earliest. They're more as you get into the mid-century, but that early history. And I came across a dissertation in the UW Special Collections. I think the last name is Gahagan. He had been a lumber worker, but then was working on his master's in sociology. And he did a study of lumber workers that were living in Pioneer Square in Seattle. And he documented how they moved through the region, the seasonal movement, but also that there's only so long you can live in a lumber camp and endure it. It's such hard work, and they're not great conditions at that time. This is in the 1920s. And so then you would just naturally like make the money you're going to make and then cycle back into the city. And his argument was primarily focused on people who look down on the Pioneer Square via the brothels, the bars, the gambling, all that. And his argument was, if you set up an entire industry where the workers are going to be just used to a pulp and cycled out and then recover and then go back out again, and they can't have permanent homes because there's no permanence to their lives and no security to their income, and there's such a propensity for injury, then you get Pioneer Square. Like, that is a natural outcome of that, and it doesn't do any good to moralize about it if you're going to set up circumstances where that's the community that's created.
Right.
And then I, of course, think about as logging has gotten safer and more machinery-based, then it's fewer jobs for that giant pool of labor. And that's a good thing because they're safer if they're in the machines, right? Lately it's still super dangerous, but there's fewer jobs for people. And so there's so many facets of that to look at. And then the movement between fishing, forest work, and ag work. And that, I just think that's fascinating in Washington State. That if you were an able-bodied, mostly men, but some women, there were a lot of women and peripheral jobs in the lumber industry, but you were moving around this region. And so you think of a logger, but a logger might also be a fisher and might also be an ag worker. And I just think, I wish so much we had more people's stories captured.
Yeah.
And they might be out there. Like I say, I haven't seen many, but that doesn't mean I've done a deep enough dive to say they're not out there.
Yeah, and often too, and just to bring this up, I think a lot of times you think of those workers as settlers and white folks too, but in some cases, they're migrants or migrated from other countries. They maybe have escaped something. They may be, let's say, from Mexico or Central America, and then they don't have really permanent families or homes here, and so they have that ability or capacity or willingness, I guess, to travel and do those different sort of have those skill sets to kind of flex between fishing and ag or cutting trees down or picking seed out of pine cones or stuff like those.
They have a skill set that can be adapted. I hate it when you hear people call it unskilled labor. It's like, no.
I can't remember this book. I think it's the right one. It's called Mushroom at the End of the World, right? About picking wild mushrooms and how it slips into these different streams of capital, stuff like that.
That's super interesting. And then there's the tribal members that were engaged with the market economies early years and doing logging. And it worked well because it was seasonal labor. And so it could work into seasonal rounds and be incorporated into their traditional movements and their traditional practices, but they were also logging. And then there were the communities that, and I'm going to get the names wrong, but Pierce County, there was the Japanese logging camp up in the foothills. And so there's a segregation that's happening. They're not integrated into the full workforce, but are integrated into the industry. And you see that there's numerous places around the state where you see that. And of course, there's no longer a village or a mill there. And so it's hard to pull out that story. So there's some interesting work going on. Tamika Nomura here in Tacoma is working on that. And it is documented. You just have to know where to look. And so she's been working on that.
Nice.
And we're hoping to get out to the Forest History Society. I don't know if you've ever been there in North Carolina. Quite a few Washington timber industry records have ended up out there. And so we want to go out and just do a survey, work with the archivists, and just kind of immerse ourselves. We won't ever be able to do like a dissertation length study on them, but we'll at least know from personal experience what's there. Because so much of that kind of research, you need to be there and like looking through files to really know what the articles or what the collections are.
Nice. And it's like paper, right?
Yes.
It's not digitized. So
not much of it. There is some. They do have a great Forest History Society is pretty amazing. They have some pretty great databases and collections. But we know there's a lot of good stuff out there that I know.
Gotta get your hands in.
Exactly.
Dirty. Nice. All right. Well, we look forward to phase 2, or future phases.
Yes,
we'll
future
say
phases.
Future phases of the Forest History Project. Are you ready? Can we move into rapid fire questions?
I'm ready for this.
All right, ready. If you could please complete this phrase: restoration is blank. Hopeful. Nice. Good one. Do you have a favorite tree in Washington?
Yes, ponderosa pine.
Some people refer to it as an East Side tree, I guess. All right. More surprising, do you think Seattle's regrades or the canal projects?
More surprising?
Yeah.
Oh, the canal. Well, okay.
Oh, yeah.
No, it's the regrades.
Yeah.
It's the audacity of engineers in both cases. But the regrades, who does that? And if R.H. Thompson had had his way, there would be no hills in Seattle.
I know. It would be flat.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if we've talked about it. This is a surprise question. I think we've alluded to it maybe in previous episodes, but yeah, if you think of Seattle or like Puget Sound areas, like this very green environmental area, but also just knowing there are no longer hills where there used to be in Seattle because we loosened them off. There used to be forests there and filled the traditional wetlands of the Duwamish or the Puyallup or whatever. So
thousands of acres of tidelands.
Yeah, someday talk about that some more.
Yes, that's a great story.
What are your favorite or best public archive or map collections in the state?
We are so lucky in Washington State that we have an embarrassment of riches. I love the Washington State Digital Archives. I appreciate so much the work they've done. The things you can find are amazing on there. I love the Northwest Room in the Tacoma Public Library, and their Orca search engine is, I just can't believe my luck sometimes with the things I find in there. And then the universities, I love the Washington State University Archives collection of historical maps that are from all different repositories. Oh, and I should do a plug for the Digital Public Library of America, which the Northwest Digital Archives, which is a consortium, has become a hub for that. And so they upload the digital data from digital collection in the region. And they've just recently added HistoryLink articles as items in that. And I love that people are getting sent to our, we're seeing some good traffic from that.
Nice. I know this is going to be a hard question for you to say one.
Yes.
So, yeah,
so the one, if I had to pick one.
It's all right.
That's not possible.
It's all right.
Too many
not
cool
possible.
things.
It's like talking about your favorite ice cream.
Yes, exactly.
All right. I think we'll try to put some of those links in the show notes.
Oh, great.
Do you have a next dream project?
Someday the next big special project we'll take on is technology, history of technology. And there's the obvious stories there, right? Microsoft, Amazon, different things like that. But there's also all the biotechnology that's come out of Washington. And then there's technology in the sense of how did our kind of anchor industries change with technology. And then also I love that old technology is being pulled back to the forefront. So like the halibut hook that the Makah tribe designed over eons, it turns out that it is an incredibly effective tool for catching halibut and nothing else. And that's always been a hard thing with the halibut industry is bycatch. And so they're pulling that design forward to the industry today because it's a genius technology. And so I think that's going to be a really fun one because it'll be interesting. I appreciate when we take on the obvious topics because it's like, I know that story, but I don't really know that story. Like we will soon have an REI history up. And I was so happy to read the draft because like now I know the sequence of events and the interconnections confidently.
Nice.
So that'll be fun with technology, I think.
Cool. Looking forward to it. Yeah.
And the forest history ties into the technology because that funding, that the money that was made by the owners of those industries, a lot of it was invested in our nascent technology industry. And so there's a direct connection.
Wow. That's short tether, huh?
Yes.
Okay. Last question. I've been making this mix of music suggested from recent guests. And so I was wondering if you had a song to contribute to the mixtape. Forest related, or it could be not.
So that is a good story or a good question. The one I think of is skips alongside. It's Homecoming by Josh Ritter. And the reason why I would say that one is I love him, but also I associate him. He grew up in Idaho and I lived in the Midwest for a while, and every time we would drive back and forth and we would get to Livingston, Montana, and we'd hit the trees again, I felt like I was back home. And then there's also that place when you're coming over 90 and you turn down from the crest, from the pass, and there's just the green forest in front of you. And that's home to me, right? I've lived in proximity to forests, except for when I lived in the Midwest. My whole life. And so I think that's a good song.
Reminds you of home.
I've never worked in the forest, but it is home.
For me, it's like the mountain, like certain aspects, like views of the mountain for sure, like remind me of home. Yeah, certain forests. I definitely feel at home. Like, I don't know, I left the Pacific Northwest for the first time out of college. So there's some Peace Corps time in like Central South America, and it's like, it's like they sent me to like Mars basically. It's like I felt so out of place, but come to appreciate different landscapes. It's always nice to be coming home, feel some belonging.
It's funny you say that about the mountains. Our fundraiser every year we do a theme. This year is the Mountain Out is our theme.
Oh, nice.
And it's going to be different stories about how our mountains have shaped our history and our relationship with them. And so much of it is, I'm never going to climb a mountain. I'm not in any kind of shape to do that. But I love those mountains, right? They're just part of living here and knowing this place. So, yeah, it's pretty cool.
So, well, I guess to close out, is there a way the listeners can find HistoryLink or kind of follow your stuff or you?
Yes, so we are on social media. We're on Instagram and Facebook and Blue Sky. HistoryLink will get you there if you search that. And then historylink.org. And for any educators who are listening, we're about to beta launch. And next year we'll do a full launch of teachhistorylink.org, which will be a resource for educators to use HistoryLink as easily as possible. So keep an eye out for that. And we do have our podcasts, which are very fun. There's the Field Notes with HistoryLink will launch in mid-September.
I'll put those links in the show notes. Thanks for coming down to Tacoma.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for hanging out in the studio.
It's awesome.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Good to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Yeah.
That's a wrap on this episode. I want to thank Jennifer Ott for taking us behind the scenes of the Forest History Project and for reminding us that history is not just what's written in books. It's about whose voices we uplift, what patterns we recognize, and how we carry those insights forward into land care, climate adaptation, and community memory. One thing that sticks with me is how HistoryLink makes regional history free, accessible, and community-centered, which mirrors what we try to do in ecological restoration by honoring the past, staying rooted in place, and making room for many voices to shape the future. When we know more about how land has been shaped, like by bulldozers, dams, policy, protests, and stories, we make better choices about what we restore and why. This podcast is a labor of love and curiosity, a space to explore the intersections of ecology, justice, and narrative. I hope it sparks something in you. Speaking of sparks, I'll be giving a talk later this month with the Tacoma Tree Foundation called Plants as Teachers. It's happening midday, January 28th. I'll be exploring habitat care and adaptation in a warming world. We talk about some species we call weeds are doing important work, emerging in disturbed soils, responding to heat and water stress, and offering food and medicine. So rather than thinking in terms of good versus bad species, we'll focus on what plants are doing, which signals they respond to, and what they can teach us about living through change. Come ready to rethink weeds, climate stress, love for land, and imagining better futures. I'll put a registration link in the show notes, or you can find it on the Tacoma Tree Foundation calendar. If this episode resonated with you, I'd love to hear about it. Your feedback, reflections, and stories help me shape future episodes. You can email me at treehuggerpod@gmail.com or find me on Instagram at treehuggerpod. The full archive of episodes lives online at treehuggerpod.com. You can listen anytime, dig into show notes, or share an episode that moved you. And hey, if you believe in this work and want to help me keep the mic on, consider donating. I'm a totally independent creator, no ads, no big backers, very autonomous. And you can spark stories like these that ripple out into practice. Every bit helps cover hosting fees, production tools, and coffee for editing marathons. Because I do not like editing, I need all the help I can get. You can donate at PayPal, Venmo, Cash App. Those links are in the show notes and on the website. And of course, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on your favorite podcast platform of choice. It really does help people find the show. And you can always just tell a friend about the show. Thanks again for listening. I'll leave you with this reminder. The stories we carry shape the futures we grow. Take care of your places, your people, and yourself. With love and dirt under the fingernails, see you in the woods.